Madam President, we've begun consideration of this year's National Defense Authorization Act, which is annual legislation to authorize funding for our military and national defense. Like last year's bill, this year's National Defense Authorization Act emphasizes military modernization and readiness and the need to ensure that we are prepared to counter threats from great powers like China and Russia, as well as terrorists and rogue states. I'm offering a handful of amendments to this legislation, including an amendment to address training opportunities for our nation's military pilots and air crews. In my home state of South Dakota, we are privileged to play host to Ellsworth Air Force Base, home of two B-1 bomb squadrons of the 28th Bomb Wing, the airmen who are the backbone of operations, as well as the 89th Attack Squadron and its control stations for MQ-9 Reapers. It's also home to the Powder River Training Complex, training airspace for Ellsworth air crews and crews from across the United States. And in the very near future, Ellsworth will be the home of the forthcoming B-21 bomber. When I was first elected to the Senate, Ellsworth's future was not looking bright. In fact, in 2005, just a few months into my first term, Ellsworth was targeted for closure by the Base Realignment and Closure Commission. Fortunately, thanks to the efforts of a lot of dedicated people, we managed to demonstrate to the Commission that Ellsworth was a vital national security asset and that closing the base and moving its fleet of B-1s would actually cost money. And since then, strengthening Ellsworth has been a priority for me and for a lot of other people back home in South Dakota. And Ellsworth has been going from strength to strength. One of my proudest achievements, Madam President, as a senator, was helping secure the expansion of the Powder River Training Complex, the training airspace over Ellsworth. The expansion quadrupled the size of the airspace. But prior to the expansion, the airspace was only large enough for one B-1 bomber to train at a time, which meant crews had to commute elsewhere to meet their training needs. Today, the airspace is large enough to hold large force training exercises involving a variety of planes from other bases. In fact, the Powder River Training Complex is now the largest training airspace in the continental United States. In addition to the vast space it offers for training exercises, it also provides a valuable opportunity for pilots to train in conditions that resemble combat missions, such as low-altitude flying over mountainous terrain. Since the Powder River Training Complex was expanded, Ellsworth has hosted a number of successful large force exercises. This May, Ellsworth hosted its most recent Combat Raider large force exercise, which featured B-1, B-2 and B-52 bombers, J-STAR and AWACS radar systems, F-16s and KC-135 tankers. Notably, F-35s from Hill Air Force Base in Utah also participating, marking the first of what I think will be many training opportunities for the F-35 in the Powder River Training Complex. These combat raider exercises highlight the potential of the PRTC for training our military aviators, and I want to make sure that we can meet these training needs as we look to bring the B-21 into the fleet. That's why I filed an amendment, Thune Amendment 759, to require a strategic airspace review. My amendment would require a report on how far our current national airspace system meets our national security requirements and how we might improve the system to meet current and future training needs. The Air Force and the Federal Aviation Administration would be required to consult on this report to develop a full picture of the strategic value of our national airspace. The report would also analyze whether the current airspace system gives the military sufficient access to the airspace that it requires to meet its worldwide operational training and testing needs. In particular, it seeks to determine whether current civil and military cooperation mechanisms are providing for the effective and efficient management of the national airspace system for military training. It also seeks, or I should say it also asks, whether the current Department of Defense and FAA processes provide sufficient time to plan for large force exercises. For example, in the Powder River Training Complex, the Air Force needs to go through a lengthy process to secure altitude waivers from the FAA to fly higher on just a few days a year for just a few hours a day. We absolutely need to have appropriate procedures to ensure that safety and coordination with commercial airlines, but the Air Force also needs enough lead time to schedule its aircraft and airmen traveling from other bases. We shouldn't be missing out on critical training opportunities because of a lengthy process that is ripe for expediting. So my amendment, Madam President, would take a look at this process, including whether FAA air traffic control centers could temporarily or permanently realign their boundaries to streamline their role in military training. For example, the Powder River Training Complex straddles the convergence of the Minneapolis, Denver, and Salt Lake City air traffic control centers, and coordinating with all three can be cumbersome. This report would explore whether we can make the process more efficient for both the FAA and the military. It would also review whether the current airspace system is sufficient to prepare military aviators to meet high-end threats, including fifth-generation aircraft, unmanned aerial vehicles, and hypersonic weapons. It's important that we ensure that our airmen can train in realistic conditions so that they can deliver when America is counting on them the most. Just like in sports, you play like you practice. And although we all know this isn't play, and the stakes for getting it right are very high. That's why my amendment would investigate whether current civil and military cooperation mechanisms are sufficient for our military to replicate contested combat airspace, denied access airspace, and airspace without the use of GPS, the kind of conditions air crews would likely encounter if they got the call to fight tonight. My amendment also takes a step back to look at the state of our national airspace system. It calls for an audit of special use airspaces, military operations areas, commercial routes, and other routes. And it asks if parts of underutilized airspaces can be effectively returned to the national airspace to boost commercial route efficiencies in high-traffic areas in exchange for more generous military training flight permissions in low-traffic areas. Comparatively, we don't get as much commercial airline traffic up in the Powder River Training Complex, creating a great opportunity for fifth-generation aircraft to really stretch their legs and to meet their training needs. Madam President, I've talked a lot about our military's need to have the best training opportunities available. However, I want to clarify that this is not a one-sided amendment. Our military goes to great lengths to respect commercial and general aviation needs, and that's reflected in my amendment. First and foremost, the FAA is consulted throughout the entire report process. Additionally, the bill reviews whether commercial and general aviation receive sufficient notice regarding exercises and special use waivers. And as I mentioned, it looks for ways to make Department of Defense and FAA interaction more efficient. As a former chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee and a current member of the Commerce Subcommittee on Aviation and Space, I know that the management of the national airspace is complicated. My amendment simply seeks to gather information so that we can take a productive look at our national airspace and make sure that our military aviators can get the most out of their training opportunities while respecting the needs of commercial and general aviation. Madam President, the Armed Services Committee Chairman and Ranking Member, my colleagues and staff members have a lot of amendments to consider. Hundreds of amendments have already been filed on the National Defense Authorization Act, and there are more to come. I would ask that my amendment, number 759, be considered for inclusion as we work together to restore and modernize our military and ensure that our men and women in uniform have the tools that they need to defend our country. I thank my colleagues, and I yield the floor.